So we're in a series entitled This Is Us, and we are looking at the motivations for the things that are happening during this season. Why would there be a Project Share? Why would we see a bigger picture? Why would we seek to bless our community and just people beyond ourselves? And it has a lot to do with the events that unfolded during a Christmas season some 2,000 years ago. And today we're going to jump into one of those Christmas passages. And my guess is if you're familiar at all with the Christmas story, if we read it there many times, when you come here, it kind of reads this way. You know, there was this governor, Quirinius, and he issued this census, and Mary and Joseph had to go, and angels show up, and all of that. And all of that's included. But the way that Matthew, who writes the first of the Gospels, the accounts of the life and times of Jesus, he doesn't start there. When Matthew introduces a Christmas story and he's just going to start, where it begins, he starts with a genealogy. Genealogy. This person begat that person, begat that person, begat that person, and those names are really hard to say. And a lot of them, we just don't know who they are and what that means or what that has to do with anything connected to the Christmas story. Well, today we're going to try to understand that. Why Matthew would show us the genealogy, the background, the ancestry, if you will, of Jesus, because it's a very important part of the story. The whole ancestry thing has become a big business in our day, hasn't it, right? There's all these different companies that are out there, and you spit in a tube, and you get back this DNA that tells you where you came from. Well, last Christmas, my wife Sally got me that as a Christmas gift. And I said, that's really nice, but I don't really think I need that because there's just not a lot of surprises. My parents are from Germany. I was born here, but that's where they were from. And as far back as we can tell, that is where my family comes from. And so I thought, it's going to come back 99%. It's going to be in that direction. Well, there was a surprise. So some of the DNA results that came back, the biggest group was 57% Western Europe, and I think I know what that is. And that was kind of expected, but I thought, if anything, maybe 97, not 57. Well, what makes up the rest of it then? The next biggest amount was Scandinavian. And can I just translate that for you? Viking. How awesome is that, right? It's like, wow, build a small wooden boat and sail across the Atlantic and conquer lands that have yet to be discovered. But I think that's already been done. But there's part of this sense of me where I'm like, I had no idea, and that's kind of cool, and my family can attest. Now, when there are things that come up, and I'll say something like, only Vikings really understand that, so you guys wouldn't understand what that is, being a Viking and all. But it made me wonder, is that really the case? And, is there even, some resemblance, to Viking people and Viking sort of things. So I looked up a couple pictures, and I don't know, you can just judge for yourself and see, is there any resemblance? I don't know. You judge for yourself. I'm still undecided. I had one other one that I found there. I don't know, could go either way. Could go either way. And so, when it comes to football, right, if you're a Viking, you already have a team that's out there, right, the Vikings. And so I thought, well, that's kind of a natural fit. So I went to a Viking game, got a picture there. Yeah, I'm not going to sell that out. I'll stick with the Cowboys. Here's the whole list of things that came up in that DNA result thing. And I got to be honest with you, I'm like, that's surprising. Had no idea. And my guess is that if we all did that, we would probably be surprised by what we find in our history, in our ancestry, maybe even within our own lifetime, what's included in that. And here's why it is important that Matthew begins the story of Jesus coming into this world as a baby in a manger in Bethlehem with a genealogy, because he's writing to a very Jewish audience that was familiar with what we call the Old Testament. And every good Jewish person who knew the Old Testament knew that the Messiah that was coming one day, who was going to redeem this world, this was going to be the one who was going to begin to change things, and ultimately one day they would be completely and finally changed. But when he comes, we know this because there's all kinds of predictions made about it. He is connected to King David in the Old Testament. And so you need to show that there is that connection. If you want to claim to be the Messiah, you better show that he's connected to David. And if you can't show that, you know what? Conversation over. You can't even make that claim because everybody knows that's clear. In that day, a genealogy was like a resume in our day. You want to show that you're qualified for the job? Let's see it. And so if you want to show that you are qualified to be the Messiah, you better show that you are connected to King David. Now here's the thing with resumes in our day, and the estimates are 80 to 90% of the resumes that people put out are not accurate. Right? People embellish certain things and they hide other things and they leave some things out. A lot of people who are hiring folks for a job will look at resumes and go, hey, where's that 4-year gap? What were you doing in those 4 years? I was doing a lot of relief work. Yeah, it was a lot of relief work, deep in the jungle. And you can't contact that organization because they're deep in the jungle. That I got to go. I don't think this is going to work out for me. And a lot of times what people do is they hide or they leave out the parts that they would rather not have people know about them, right? And probably everybody has one of those moments in their lives where they started a job and they just didn't show up, or they didn't like the job and it just didn't work out, or we had conflict and all of that, and we just went our separate ways, and we go, yeah, I don't want to talk to that, and I don't want them to talk to that boss. Well, here's the interesting part with Matthew's genealogy. Instead of hiding some rather surprising things, and not surprising in a, hey, wow, that's really cool, but hiding in a way that is basically saying, are you kidding me? That's in there? Matthew doesn't hide it. He flaunts it in front of us. And why would he do that? Well, let's look at some of those surprises in Jesus' genealogy. Then we're going to talk about why that is important and why Matthew did it. So Matthew chapter 1, we're just going to jump into a couple of verses here. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Rahab is a woman, and here is something right out of the chute that would be very surprising to people reading genealogies in those days. You didn't reference women. It would be husband and father after father after father, and husband after husband after husband. And I'm not saying it's right, but the way it was in the ancient world for the most part is the value of men was here and the value of women was here, and often women were even treated like a piece of property. And so Matthew, why would you even reference somebody like that? You're kind of discrediting in the eyes of the people who are reading this. Yeah, I know. And along comes Jesus one day, and unlike any other rabbi of his day, a number of those who followed him were women. And based on what he taught and based on how he lived, later came this radical idea that was shared by the Apostle Paul in a book called Galatians. And he says, in this new kind of community that he came to start, there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. Now, he's not saying there's no difference that you can observe. What he's saying is the value is the same. Nobody has done more to elevate the value of women in this world than Jesus. And the idea that we take for granted in our day that there is equal value between men and women, where did that come from? It has not always been true in this world of ours. Look no further than Jesus. Is it any wonder Matthew references some of that? And those who would never be mentioned are mentioned. And I think what this tells us is, you know who's included in the background of Jesus? Those who are forgotten and overlooked, in whatever form and fashion they come. Those who were looked at by others around them to say, you know what, they don't have value. There's not a lot of worth in them. To God they do. And he includes them. And so Matthew goes out of his way to say, oh yeah, nobody else would mention this? We will. I will. This is a part of who Jesus is. But maybe you know something else about Rahab, and if you've been around church or the Bible, you may know that she is often referenced in conjunction with her profession before God shows up in her life. And she is sometimes referred to by that whole expression, and maybe some of you know this, Rahab the harlot, prostitute. Matthew, why would you point that out in the background of Jesus? Yeah, you know, my great-great-great-great-grandmother, if we ever found this in our ancestry, right, would we ever do this? Yeah, she was a prostitute. You know, people used to pay her. You know, she was hot and all that, and so there was all this kind of stuff. We wouldn't reference that. You write that out of the resume. Matthew's saying, here you go. It's front and center. I'm going to put it right in front of you. Wow. Surprise, not in a, hey, that's cool kind of way. Surprise in a, really? You know what that also tells us? Those with a checkered past are included in the background of Jesus. That's his lineage. And Matthew goes out of his way to make it clear that that's a part of what happened before he came. Well, here's another verse in that genealogy. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And this is a story that's a little bit more under the radar, but let me tell you, Judah is Tamar's father-in-law. And Tamar is not allowed to preserve the family line, and her husband is denying her that option, and so she comes up with an interesting solution to that problem. She dresses up as a prostitute. Judah is looking for a prostitute. And so he makes his way and she gets in his path, and she winds up preserving the family line through her father-in-law. Ew. That's like icky, right? And Matthew, why would you mention that? Because that just seems weird. And seems like it shouldn't be there. That's the stuff we sweep under the carpet, not the stuff that we put out there for everybody to see. You know what it tells us? You know who else is included? Those who are manipulative, schemers, who come up with all kinds of convoluted motives and intentions, and ultimately they play out in actions that deceive, that work in ways that are just outside of what God would have for us. Yeah, that's included. Here's another verse in the genealogy. And finally, Matthew, you get to David. All you had to do was tell us that Jesus is related to David, and we get it. The resume is there. Yep, it's in there. We can now have a conversation about it. But even when he mentions David, he doesn't present it in the way that we think he should. David, that's all you have to say, was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah. Now, if you know anything about that story, that's something else you wouldn't put out there. Because here's how that plays out. David is the king. He is large and in charge. He is at the height of his power and success. And he's out in the city of Jerusalem when his army is out fighting a battle. He should be with his men, but he is not. He is back in Jerusalem, taking it easy, and he's feeling really good about all that has been accomplished. And he's on a rooftop, and he spies a woman bathing on another rooftop, and he sends for her, and he winds up having an adulterous affair with somebody else's wife, one of his bodyguards, one of his soldiers. And he might think, well, you know what, that can be over as soon as, that happened, no big deal. Well, she winds up getting pregnant as a result of that affair. And the husband's at the front lines, and people know how this works, and they can add up the number of months and days and all of that, and they're going to realize it wasn't him, it was somebody else. And so David comes up with a solution to that problem. He says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put Uriah, one of my brave men, we're going to put him right in the front of the battle. And we're going to charge at the enemy, and when the time comes, he tells his generals, everybody withdraw except you leave Uriah out in the front there. And sure enough, the plan unfolds the way that David devises it, and his guy gets killed in battle. But it was all planned and arranged. Oh, shoo, now she's a widow, and she can become my wife. Matthew, why would you point that out to us? Why couldn't you just say David? Why did you have to include some of the sordid details of all of that? You know who else is included? The sexually broken, who find themselves further down a road planning and acting in ways that they never thought they might at some point, but then they find themselves up at a place that they didn't even know existed. And if they could undo it, they would, but it's too late, and things have happened. But not only is it somebody who's sexually broken, but David is also somebody who caused great harm to somebody else. And I think we all recognize we live in a world where that happens all the time. And it's not good, and it's not right, and we wish it could change, but here it is. And Matthew says, yeah, that's there too. It's in the lineage of the one claiming to be the Messiah, the Redeemer of this world. Why would you do that, Matthew? A couple more surprises. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab is one of those really under-the-radar names. He was born in slavery in the nation of Egypt and pretty much lived out his life in slavery. So who else is included in the background of the Messiah, the enslaved? And that can be literal or figurative. You think of slavery in our day, and this just boggles my mind. There is more human slavery in our day, on our watch, than there was at the height of slavery in this nation some 150 years ago. And I think, how is that possible? But it's true. But I think also, figuratively speaking, people can be enslaved by all kinds of things. We can be enslaved by a substance. We can be enslaved by some of the thoughts and compulsions that live inside of us. We can be enslaved by certain websites. We can be enslaved by a checkbook and a bank account and a neighborhood and something we drive. And there are all kinds of different ways in which people can be enslaved. That's included. It also says this, and Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. And there's another woman, as if you didn't, have enough impact there by saying it once. You're going to say it twice now, and there's another one. But there's something else about this woman, just like the other one, Rahab, that we reference. They are not Jewish. They come from different groups of people that were outside of the nation of Israel, and any nation in that day not named Israel did not worship the God of the Bible. They worship all kinds of different gods, gods of the ground and the air and the rain and the crops and fertility and all those kind of things. And there she is. Ruth is called a Moabitess. That sounds like a really bad disease you might get somewhere or have an allergy to. But that means she is from a group of people called Moab. And before God showed up in her life, she was doing what everybody else does there. But then her life is transformed as she is invited in and married in to what will ultimately unfold. What does this mean? You know who else is included? Spiritual outsiders. Those who come from far off. And many times what we think is that God is looking for and responding and inviting those who are getting really serious and getting their act together and are seeking to honor Him. But this story tells us, no, it's a little bit different than that. Whoever comes is invited by Him, and it is His doing. And they got to participate with Him. So Matthew, why would you do that? What does that mean that you would include all of those sordid surprises in the background of Jesus? Let me give you 3 implications of Jesus' DNA for the new type of community that He came to establish. It means this, that everybody's welcome. And this was the thing that just boggled the minds of the religious leaders of the day when Jesus went public with his ministry. So the baby born in Bethlehem 30 years later says he is the Messiah, and that he has come to redeem and to restore and to invite God's kingdom to come into this world. But he acted in some strange ways, at least to those who were on the religious inside. And it says this a couple times, and this was never meant as a compliment. It says, well, he welcomes sinners and eats with them. People like tax collectors and Roman soldiers who have us under their thumb, and prostitutes. Where would he ever get an idea like that? Where would that idea ever come from that, you know what? People like that are invited. People like that, no matter who they are, no matter where they're from, no matter what they've done, no matter what they've become, no matter what's been done to them, everybody's welcome. This doesn't mean that anything goes. It does mean anyone is welcome. And the ideas that we often create in this world go just like what those religious leaders believed in that day. You know what? You got to live right. You got to check off the list. You got to do all the things that we have defined for you. And Jesus just blew up those categories, and he loved the religious leaders, and he loved people who were far from God and had never given God a second thought, and everybody in between. And all you have to do is look at his background, look at his genealogy, look at his DNA to know he understands that this world is broken and every single person in it is broken. And that if we knew the truth and the reality of where we come from, and if we could even bring out into the light some of the things that we've done in our own day, in our own time, with our own decisions, they would be things that we would rather sweep under the carpet. But God knows it. And to him it's front and center. And you know what he says? Not anything goes. He says, everybody's welcome. You can come. And it's at his invitation. It's not our doing. You see, the way it's been devised in this world for so long, it goes something like this, that when we create this idea of how do people like us get right with God, we think we just got to get busy and we got to get serious and we got to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we got to do all the right things. That's called religion. And religion is mankind doing what they think they must do in order to work their way to God. What we find in Jesus' life is God, in his grace and his mercy, working his way all the way to us. And everybody's welcome, no matter who you are. And the things that are true about you and me, he knows them, and he says that you're welcome. It also means that nobody's perfect. That in this kind of community here, it must never become the kind of place where a certain group of people say, yep, you know what, we've arrived, we've achieved it, we've done it, and everybody else still has a ways to go. And how easy it would be to look out at this world of ours and, one week after another for us to point out some of the evils, some of the darkness, some of the mistakes in our culture. That would be so easy. But you know what it would not do? It would not change anything out there, and it would not change anything in here. But instead, imagine a kind of community where all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds, different experiences, different stuff that messes them up, different struggles that they have in their life, where they say, you know what? That may not be my struggle that you have, but I got struggles. And so in this community, we are all in process of being transformed by the grace and the power of God. And there isn't room here for us to condemn or to write anybody off, because I am in need of as much of God's grace as anybody else. And how does this world of ours change? It changes one heart and one life at a time. But not by cursing the darkness. Instead, it happens by proclaiming the light. And so it's that kind of community where there's a measure of humility as we understand who we are and how far maybe we've fallen short of what God has in store for us. We say, well, where does that come from? Well, the Bible tells us it goes all the way back to a specific day when a man named Adam and a woman named Eve decided that the parameters that God had set for them, He had given them everything they could possibly need. But they decided, you know what, He's holding out on us, so we're going to step outside of that. We're going to do what we think is right, and we will become more like God because He's holding that back from us. And in that moment, there was a spiritual death that occurred. That mankind was unplugged from the giver of life. And a spiritual death occurred, and the process of dying occurred, and we all know what that is, right? I mean, probably you looked in the mirror this morning, and you know what? We just don't look as good as we used to, do we? We know what that process is like, and then, one day you look in the mirror, and if you're a dude, you go, Dad, when did you show up here? And if you're a woman, you go, Mom, when did you arrive? And we know how that goes. The Bible says that's what you can trace it back to. Was a day on which mankind decided to unplug from the giver of life. And ever since then, the nature of mankind, every single man and woman and child, has been twisted, bent, and broken. And the kind of community that God created is that this side of heaven, there would be nobody there who is perfect. So it isn't about pointing the finger, but rather, what is it that God wants to do inside of me? How do I participate with God in the transformation that He wants to carry out in my heart and my life? So everybody's welcome. Nobody's perfect. And one more thing, anything is possible. And when you see the community that Jesus created and the way that He worked in hearts and lives, it was not just a self-help technique so people could do better. It was a whole new kind of life that could be lived inside of the grace and the love of God. It was the kind of life where you could be safe because God's love for you is not conditional towards you. He loves you just as you are. And He wants to take you somewhere really good. And that's why somebody like Peter, who was sometimes full of some false pride and thought he was a little bit more than he really was, made some pretty boastful statements. Yeah, if anybody else denies you, I'll never deny you. And sure enough, at Jesus' most difficult moment, Peter lies and curses and runs off like a scared kid. And then after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, Jesus finds him. He's gone back to what he was doing before he ever met Jesus, and that was fishing. And He invites him back into what He has in store. Peter, you're a part of it. And Peter goes on to become one of the influential leaders in the early days of the church. And he becomes a different guy. And the guy who was afraid is now willing to risk his life. And if history is correct, and I think it is, it tells us that one day, Peter, who was going to be crucified just like Jesus was, didn't even think he was worthy to die in the same way that Jesus did. He said, "Crucify me upside down." How does somebody change like that? You need to look no further than the grace, the love, and the power of God. Anything's possible. Because at the end of the day, it's not just us and our resources and our capabilities and our IQ. It is the grace, the mercy, the love, and the power of God. Well, we're going to sum up all of this in one sentence. How would you put it? I'd put it this way. Your history does not determine your destiny. Doesn't matter where you come from family-wise, and even in your own life, it doesn't matter what's in your past. Everybody's welcome. Nobody's perfect. Anything is possible. And lives can be transformed, can be changed. One life, one heart at a time. I'm going to invite you to bow your heads together with me as I pray. And just before I do, beginning a relationship with God, not religion, but a relationship, is not complicated, but it can be challenging because it seems to run counter to so many of the ideas that we might have about what it takes to be made right with a holy God. Because it's not about our effort. God's favor is not dependent on our behavior. God's favor is freely given to those who receive it. And so what that means for people like us is that we just acknowledge to God, yeah, I've been unplugged from the giver of life, but I want to plug into that. It means asking him to forgive us of our sins, and that's who we are, all of us. It's not exactly the same, but we have that in common. It's asking him to make us a part of his family. And any sincere heart that turns in that direction, it's not someday when we've reached a certain level. It is in that moment. A relationship begins, and it continues through the rest of this life and on throughout eternity. It's committing the rest of your days to follow him, and we don't do that perfectly. And again, that is not a reason to say, oh well, anything goes. No. It is a reason for us that even on the days that we fall, we get back up and we draw close to him once again. God, thank you for the endless love that you bestow upon us. We don't deserve any of it. And truth be told, it's in spite of us. But that's who you are, and that is what you have done. And so, God, help us to become the kind of community where everybody's welcome, where we recognize that we're all a work in progress here. We're all under construction. Nobody's perfect. And we're going to leave some room for you to do what only you can do. Anything's possible. That lives can be transformed by your grace, by your power. Lead us in that direction, God. And thank you for this season that shows us your great love for each one of us. Let it be a time of celebrating you. Let it be a time of that value becoming more a part of who we are. And God, also let it be a season through which we can be a conduit to bless lives beyond ourselves, to bless our community in your name and for your sake. And so we ask and pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.